Thanks for that, Jeffrey. We've just spoken about verification, and I want to come to a slightly different problem related to that. Now, it seems to me that a fundamental tenet of arms control for the longest time has been that science can be trusted, meaning that when we talk about the verification of treaty compliance, we think that there's information that can be gathered to do that, that is credible and verifiable. Yet in recent years, we've had a lot of disinformation in our space. If we think about Russian disinformation on biolabs in Ukraine, or in recent years on chemical weapons used in Syria, to give just two examples, which seem to challenge this fundamental tenet. And it seems to me that that could pose a big problem to the future of arms control treaties and trust in them. Now, you do a lot of work on satellite imagery, open source intelligence, and a lot of cutting edge stuff is happening in that space. How can that kind of work help mitigate the problem posed by disinformation?
You know, the first thing I would say is that disinformation is a really old problem. I am not sure that there is more disinformation today. My hypothesis is that we're more aware of it. So I kind of like Soviet disinformation is like one of my favorite things. So I don't know if you know the story of OTRAG, which was this private German space launch firm that set up in Zaire to try to do commercial space launches in the 70s, which is a really wild.
So please share the story.
Yeah, I love OTRAG. The Soviets engage in this enormous campaign of disinformation about OTRAG, which ultimately they used to justify, I believe it's an Angolan invasion of a part of Zaire. And it puts enormous political pressure on the French, who then lean on the Germans. And so the French lean on on Mobutu in Zaire to throw them out. And they also lean on the Germans to shut them down. And it eventually they do, right? They shut them down. And I actually don't think OTRAG, when it was in Zaire, was a secret rocket program. But then in desperation, they go to Libya, where it is absolutely a secret missile program, right? The point is, like, reputable Washington journalists were repeating that disinformation. There's one fella I'm pretty sure was maybe even on the payroll for the Soviets. And so these kinds of things, the amount of disinformation, I think, has always been extremely high. One reason I think we're more aware of it today is because it's easier to fact check. And so I kind of have this sneaking suspicion that things seem worse today, because back in the old days, if somebody told you that OTRAG was a secret Nazi rearmament thing, you'd be like, I don't know. And they'd be like, well, here's this magazine, here's this issue here, or here's this article in Penthouse, which, by the way, is where it was actually published. And you're like, I only read it for the articles, but you'd be like, I guess, right? It's a real journalist with a real article. Maybe you're right. Today, you're going to have so much more information, right? That you're going to be able to see through that stuff. So I think of like MH17 as being a pretty good example, where, in the old days, I think it would be very hard to tell whether the Russians were telling the truth or not about who shot the aircraft down. Today, it's like, if you really made like any effort at all, like you would know. Right? So I think what's happening is, in the old days, it was easy to say like, well, reasonable people can disagree. And today we're like, no, actually they can't. And you realize like how many of your fellow human beings are profoundly unreasonable. And I think that's disorienting and it's upsetting. So having said that, like in terms of like, what does that mean for arms control? Arms control was always founded on the idea that you would strike agreements that could be verified. So, for example, early arms control treaties don't count nuclear weapons, they count silos. And you only start counting actual warhead loadings recently when you have the inspections that you need in order to be able to do that kind of work. So I think that, we live in an era today where there is so much more data available to the government, but also to those of us on the outside, that I think we can much more easily imagine robust verification schemes than we could in the past. And the open source piece, like even though you wouldn't necessarily design an arms control regime around the open source work we do, I think the open source work we do is very indicative of how things have changed in a positive way, which is to say there's a ton of data out there. We used commercial satellite imagery plus Google Maps to spot the early stage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because as soon as the Russian tanks got on the road, the Russians put up roadblocks so civilians wouldn't get run over on the Russian side. Well, when they did that, the civilians are all carrying phones, and their phones noticed that the road was suddenly impassable. So if you imagine that we now live in this world that everything is recorded, right? Our patterns of life are constantly being recorded on our phones. We're just in a data-rich environment. You can imagine, I think, a lot of new things we could do that would make it much easier to implement government-level monitoring of arms control agreements. And then because we have this robust public debate, you're in a position where you can explain how those agreements work to people, and they're likely to understand them. So on the technical side, like, I'm actually really enthusiastic about the era we live in. It's just the fact that everybody seems to have gone crazy and is really excited about having a new arms race that bums me out. But I think I think we lack the political will. Technically, if you took the future back to, like, say 1988 or something, and you showed Roald Sagdev and the other people around Gorbachev, like, all the stuff we were going to be able to do, they would be psyched, and then you'd have to, like, bum them out by saying, like, actually, no, it sucks. You're going to want to die before this happens.